So this is the picture I showed you before of my grandfather in 1943, okay? This is him just 2 years later in 1945. As you can see, he's aged pretty dramatically. It looks like he's aged about 10 years in those 2 years, right? Here he's about 30, which is what he was. And over here he looks, 45. So even for the guys who survive, try to imagine the amount of stress that would have put that many lines on that face in just 2 years. He's obviously seen some pretty brutal things, in that time. So my grandfather passed away in 1997, okay, when I was 25. And a couple years after that, my grandmother, was going into long-term care. She couldn't take care of herself anymore, and didn't have her husband and all that stuff. And so there was the whole process of cleaning out their house and selling the property, all that. And like a lot of people from their generation that survived the Great Depression and survived the Second World War, they never threw anything away. And they lived in the same house pretty much since the Second World War. So cleaning out their house was a little like cleaning out the back room in a museum. I mean, there was a lot of junk, but there was also some really interesting stuff left laying around. Things like his helmet, okay? And I started to gather up some of this stuff just because, I found it interesting. I had no idea I'd be doing a book, of course, but I just, I didn't want some of this stuff to be thrown away. I also have his medals, okay? And some more things that, aren't so obvious. Like, I found this map of England, okay, that he got when he was over there during his training. And I'm an illustrator and a designer, and I really like the look of this map. I love 1940s design styles and stuff, so I picked this up just because I thought it looked really cool. But then when I opened it up, I saw that my grandfather had circled all the golf courses. He loved golf, till the day he died, and this was really, this really made me laugh to open up and see this, because, obviously during training, he'd get a little bit of time off, he'd find a golf course, him and the other officers would go and play. And I swear he circled every golf course in the south of England on this map. So that was a fun thing to discover. More importantly, I found this diary. Okay, it's a 1943 diary. And this was in the top drawer of his dresser next to the box of medals that I showed you earlier. And I opened it up and I began to read, and this was the very first entry. I just opened at random to just a random page, and this was the first entry I read. It's Friday, March 26, 1943, and it describes how him and Jack they've arrived in England, okay, and these days we just fly, if we're going to Europe, but in the 40s it was like a 2-week trip by boat across the Atlantic. So when the guys get there, they'd already be, dog-tired from 2 weeks of travel. So when you got there, you get the weekend off. It's called disembarkation leave. They just give you, a bit of rest and relaxation before they threw you into training. So him and Jack took their leave in London. And they're doing all the stuff that two young guys would do in London. They're seeing the sights, they're having dinner, they're having a few drinks, and whatever. It describes how they see a movie, okay, Let's Face It, starring Bob Hope and Betty Hutton, and it was quite good. And then on the way home, they see a woman who's been hit by a double-decker bus. And then the last line is, found out later she was killed. This really stuck with me, okay, for obvious reasons. Okay, it's a pretty dramatic thing to read. I mean, if any of us in Canada, like if one of us walked out of here and saw this on, in the middle of the street out in front of the school, it would be pretty shocking. But it's even more shocking when you think about what these guys must have been going through, right? Because they've just enlisted to fight in a war. They've been shipped out overseas. They're in a strange country where they've never been. They must know they're going to probably see combat at some point, okay? And they must have been afraid, right? And they must have known at some point they'd start seeing dead people. But almost the minute they got off the boat, they step off and there's dead people laying in the street. It must have been, given what they were going through, it must have been just horrifying. And so, like I said, at this point I had no idea that I'd be doing a book or anything, but stuff like this was starting to kind of stick with me. And, would sort of come up later when I did decide to do the book. So, a little about my career. Not long after this, I started You know, I was doing a lot of illustration work in the 90s, and that eventually led to some work in comics. You know, the whole graphic novel thing kind of took off about 10 years ago, so I started doing books like Days Like This was my first book with a well-known comics writer named Jay Torres. He wrote Teen Titans and all kinds of other stuff you might know. So Days Like This was set in the early 60s during the sort of girl group era. It's loosely based on a singing group called the Shirelles, who, you know, I'm sure most of you don't know except the adults. The adults probably know the Shirelles. My second book was called Scandalous, also with Jay. And it was about two rival gossip columnists in Hollywood in the early 50s, during the whole sort of McCarthy blacklist era, and I'm sure you'll be getting to that in some of your history classes. My first book I wrote myself was called Northwest Passage. It's actually here. Different cover, but different edition, but there it is. It's a historical adventure book set against the Canadian fur trade in the 18th century. So I was getting a bit of a reputation in the industry as kind of the history guy, you know, or at least someone who wasn't afraid to roll up my sleeves and do a little bit of research. And so a lot of people who knew my career and knew, you know, a little bit about my grandfather's story, I mean, friends would come over to the house and I'd show them, you know, the helmet and the medals and the map and the diary, and I've got a bunch of paperwork from the invasion of Normandy, and I've got all sorts of little things like meal tickets from the boat on the trip over. And, you know, I've got an incredible amount of detailed stuff. And they would, you know, they'd look at it all and they would say to me, is this going to be your next book? And I was horrified by I would say, no, are you kidding me? You know, my grandfather was a very private man, would not have liked that kind of attention. I don't think wanted to be remembered, you know, for the war. And just, you know, I didn't trust my own abilities to do it justice. And on a practical level, I just didn't think it was possible, because my grandfather had already died, to reconstruct exactly what he'd done. I didn't think it was possible to know the entire story. But over the years, I think enough people just suggested it to me that I started to think, well, you know, maybe I would dip my toe into some research and just see if it would be possible to reconstruct these events in enough detail to actually be able to, you know, draw them.